Hello, everyone, and welcome to our workshop today. I'm Martha Frank, a family consultant at Vermont Family Network. All of our workshops, including previous ones, are recorded and can be watched on our VFN YouTube channel. The link is on our website, which is vermontfamilynetwork.org. Today's workshop, What Can the Section 504 Plan Provide for My Child with a Disability, is the fourth and final in our Back to School series. I'm excited to introduce Greg Van Buten, attorney at EdLaw New England, Pllc. Thanks so much for joining us today, Greg.
Yes, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited, I always am, to work with Vermont Family Network. I've known everyone at the network for many years, and I love Vermont Family Network and all the people who have dedicated so much time and energy and effort to what VFN does. And today, I'm really excited to talk about Section 504 and how we can use it to get a free, appropriate public education for students with disabilities. So part of the reason that we're here today is because there's a connection between Section 504 and the eligibility issues for students who are on IEPs. In Vermont, the rules for eligibility to get an IEP have been changed. Those changes have not come into effect yet because they were put off for an additional year. But they will be coming into effect next summer. And when they come into effect, a lot of students who are on 504 plans now might be eligible for IEPs as of the summer of 23, because the definition related to eligibility for an IEP is changing. And we'll take a quick look at that, and then we'll return to the 504 conversation, but I would like everyone to be aware of this. Let's look at the next slide. So we're going to return to a definition of adverse effect that's in line with a lot of other states. Some of these slides, because we have limited time, some of these slides will just be zipping through, and I won't try to cover all the language that's in here, but we decided to leave all the slides in here so that you'll have them available as a resource to go back and check with on your own. But I won't try to cover everything, just so that we can make it through all the issues we want to touch on. So let's look at the next slide. This slide talks a little bit about how this change is going to happen. Essentially, to be eligible for an IEP in the past, for a long time in Vermont, you had to show an adverse effect on an academic skill area, like reading, writing, arithmetic. And if you were getting good grades, but yet you had significant emotional or behavioral or social issues, that didn't matter, you wouldn't be eligible. But that's going to change. Let's look at the next slide. Now, in addition to looking at grades and standardized test scores, schools are going to consider how a child's emotional health or other conditions affect non-academic performance in social, behavioral, and other domains. And so you all know, those of you who have experience with IEPs or 504 plans, know how common it is for students with disabilities to have social, behavioral, or other emotional issues, and how important it is that we recognize those things. Let's look at the next slide. This is what the new language is going to look like. I put in red 2023. It was originally going to be effective this past summer, but the Agency of Education put it off for a year because they felt that they did not have enough time to train all the school districts and staff about how to implement the new rule. To me, it's pretty straightforward. You still have all the academic skill areas. It's just that now you look at the functional stuff as well. But the agency felt like it needed a year to get everybody trained, so that's why the delay. Let's look at the next slide. That's another description of adverse effect. We don't really need to look at that one. Let's look at the next one. This is the one I wanted to focus on. The basic skill areas where you have to show an adverse effect in order to be eligible for an IEP now. I'm still talking about an IEP and not a 504 plan. In the past, you had to show adverse effect in one of these things, such as written expression, basic reading, reading comprehension, math. They're all academic. But now you can see that number 9 is functional skills. That's the part in red. That's going to get added. So if your child is struggling with functional skills, which has a very broad definition to mean social, behavioral, emotional, or anything like that, then you might be eligible for an IEP. You might also have been found eligible for a 504 plan before that, but just know that the game is changing with respect to IEPs, and you're all going to want to look at whether your child might be eligible under the new rule. Okay. We can look at the next slide. Yeah, okay, so the rules are changing, as I said. They haven't changed yet, but they will soon. So right now we want to focus on Section 504 for those students who are not eligible for an IEP. What are some of the aspects of 504 that make it a powerful tool for us? Next slide, please. Section 504 is one of several federal laws that impact education. There are several that do that: the Civil Rights Act, the Rehabilitation Act, which is Section 504 is part of the Rehabilitation Act. That's the formal name for it. And the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, that's FERPA. That's about the privacy and the educational records. And then the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, known as IDEA. That's the one that authorizes IEPs. And the Americans with Disabilities Act. All of these federal statutes have a relationship to education. Let's look at the next slide. The thing that makes Section 504 different than all the other statutes, that is, laws, is that it's a non-discrimination statute. And so, like the IDEA talks about providing an IEP in order to meet the unique needs of a student, and Section 504 talks about providing a free, appropriate public education so that you're not discriminating against a student who has a disability. There are two ways at coming to the same place. The IDEA and Section 504 both arrive at, hey, you need to provide a free, appropriate public education, but one comes at it as an entitlement statute, the IDEA, and the other one comes at it as a non-discrimination statute, 504. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the great things about Section 504 is how broad it is. When you look at an IEP, you know, there are 13 categories of eligibility, you know, things like learning disability or autism or speech language impairment. There are only 13 of those. But with respect to 504, this slide here gives you an idea of just how very broad it is. Just about any physical or mental impairment of any kind that substantially limits a major life activity, and major life activity is also very broadly defined, can qualify you for Section 504. And you can get the idea here, because it can include things like cosmetic disfigurement or neurological issues or skeletal issues or respiratory issues or emotional or mental illness, specific learning disabilities, and other things more common like peanut allergies, you know, or you name it, it can generally go under 504. And this list that's on this slide, these are just examples. It's not even intended to be an exhaustive list. So think of 504 as very, very broad. Just about anything can create eligibility under 504. Okay, next slide. We said in the last slide that there had to be a disability that impacted a major life activity. Well, what are the major life activities? In this slide, you can see that they are things like caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning. I mean, it's so broad. Now, that's the other thing that's great about 504. The disability definition is very broad, and what it impacts is very broad. It's much, much broader than the things that get impacted under Vermont law, where it has to impact, you know, reading, writing, arithmetic. And as we saw, that's soon going to include functional skills in Vermont. But 504 is much broader even than Vermont's new definition is going to be. So again, just think of 504 as very, very broad. Okay, next slide, please. Also, if you have a disability and you're using mitigating measures like vision devices or medical supplies or different auxiliary aids and services, that doesn't affect a person having a disability under Section 504. Okay, next slide. And when you look at whether the disability impacts a major life function, you just look at whether it impacts a major life activity more than it would impact the average person. So you don't have to show that there's this huge discrepancy or this huge adverse effect or any kind of calculation. The courts have made it clear that this is supposed to be a pretty simple, straightforward decision. And if it impacts a student more than the average person, then that's a substantial limitation. So it's kind of the third way in which Section 504 is very broad and inclusive. Okay. That's just a citation to the 504 regs if you want to look at them in detail yourself. And then the 504 regulations, I'd like to talk a little bit about this, some misconceptions about Section 504 and see if we can't clear those up, because I know a lot of parents run into this and a lot of parents are communicating with Vermont Family Network about this issue too. So be aware that Section 504 covers a lot of things, not just education. It covers, in Subpart B, it covers employment. In Subpart C, accessibility. Subpart D is the part we're talking about today, which is preschool, elementary, and secondary education. And then Subpart E is post-secondary education, meaning college or other post-secondary programs. Let's do the next slide. One thing that happens all the time with Section 504 is parents are told that all they can expect under Section 504 is to get accommodations. And nothing could be further from the truth. Part of the reason for this confusion is that in other parts of Section 504, the term reasonable accommodation is used. And over time, it's come to be thought of as part of the education section of 504, and it isn't. Here you can see that under Subpart B, employment practices, there's a section about reasonable accommodation, but that's about employment. It has nothing to do with education. Let's look at the next slide. Under subpart D, which does relate to education, it applies to any activity, any school or program that receives federal financial assistance. So one of the triggering elements of 504 is if you receive federal dollars, then you have to comply with Section 504. Next slide, please. And if schools and other organizations or entities that receive federal dollars must try to identify and locate every person with a disability in their jurisdiction. Next slide. Now, we said a minute ago that Section 504 is not about accommodations only, which parents are told all the time. What this does say for the education part of 504 is that a free, appropriate public education is required, and that the recipient of the federal dollars has to provide a free, appropriate public education to each qualified person with a disability. And remember how broad the term is in Section 504. Each person with a disability, regardless of the nature or severity of that disability. Next slide. And look at this regulation. If this is the only regulation you take away from this thing, this would be the one to make real note of. What is an appropriate education under 504? For the purpose of this subpart, the provision of an appropriate education is the provision of regular or special education and related aids and services, not just accommodations. Note that it says regular or special education and related aids and services that are designed to meet individual educational needs of persons with a disability as adequately as the needs of persons without disabilities are met. So the whole idea here is if you have a disability, you're entitled to a free, appropriate public education under Section 504 that might include services or regular or special education, not just accommodations. And the whole idea is that the education that the student receives meets the needs as adequately as the needs of persons without disabilities are met. So whatever has to be done to create a level playing field for students with disabilities under 504 to receive an appropriate education, that's what goes in the 504 plan. And I know that parents are often told, no, you don't get services, it's just accommodations, and you don't get, you know, it's just about creating access so you can get into the building. And once you get into the building, we'll just give you some accommodations, like you can sit in the front of the classroom, or you can have a little extra time on the test maybe, but it can be about a lot more than that. It can be about whatever services are necessary to provide an appropriate education, whatever the evaluations might tell you is necessary. And I know that Vermont Family Network deals with this issue all the time. Okay, next slide. One way of complying with Section 504 is to develop an IEP under the IDEA. And that's fine. There's some students who will be eligible for an IEP. And then if the district creates an IEP for them, then that also satisfies Section 504. Next slide. In order to provide an appropriate education, a school or a recipient of federal dollars can place a person with a disability or refer that person for benefits or services other than what the school operates or provides. So that means that a school district can go to an outside provider of whatever services to provide services for a student under 504 if the school district doesn't have the services that are needed. Next slide. This kind of recaps everything we've been saying about the free education. This just says that the provision of educational and related services is without cost to the person with disability or parents or guardian. So that's where the free part of the definition comes in. Next slide. Transportation is also included if a school places a student in another location, then the transportation has to be provided to and from that service. Next
Greg,
slide.
can I ask you a question? Oftentimes
sure.
we hear from families who say they've talked about different kinds of services, and a school will maybe say to them, there's no funding for that. It's not, this is not a funded initiative. Can you speak to that and what the options are for parents when they're given that information?
Yeah, there's Section 504 doesn't have any kind of exception that says services have to be provided to provide a free appropriate public education as long as there's funding for it. It doesn't say that. And it also doesn't say, oh, and by the way, if there is no funding available, then it doesn't have to be provided. Section 504 is not contingent on that. So that would just be an excuse. In Vermont, for students who are on Section 504 plans, it is largely paid for by school district dollars, as opposed to, and some federal dollars, as opposed to students on IEPs who can apply to the state for catastrophic aid, where the state will kick in dollars to the school district for services for a student who's on an IEP, if those services are really expensive. So most of the funding for a 504 student in Vermont comes from the school district budget, but the district is not allowed to say, we don't have adequate funding for this, and so you can't get it. That's not legal.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, next slide. You can tell that 504 provides a lot in terms of services because you can even get a residential placement for a student who needs it under Section 504. And as you can see here, if a public or private residential placement is necessary to provide an appropriate education to a person with disability, then the placement, including non-medical care, meaning not doctor care, but anything else, and room and board shall be provided at no cost. So, I mean, clearly, if you hear that services are not provided under Section 504, you can tell that doesn't make any sense because even a residential placement is covered under 504. Okay, next slide. An unfortunate aspect about this that I think really needs to be pointed out is that the Vermont Agency of Education website has numerous places where Section 504 is inaccurately portrayed. This is just an example where the agency is saying in this slide, Section 504 is not about educational services. We know that's wrong. It is about equal access. We know that's wrong. For the child to participate given necessary accommodations or modifications. So this Agency of Ed website item, which can be found in a whole bunch of different places on the AOE's website, is wrong that Section 504 doesn't include services. It does. We just looked at that. It's wrong that it's just about equal access, like as though it's good enough if you can show up to the building. And it's wrong that it's just about accommodations or modifications. It's very misleading. And if you're, what this does is it sends the wrong message to school districts and school district teams, so that when a parent comes to the meeting looking for a 504 plan and looking for services and whatever's necessary to provide an appropriate education, they're often met with this kind of information. No, I'm sorry, you can't get that. I don't know why the agency doesn't do a better job of explaining how broad Section 504 really is and what's available under Section 504. Maybe somebody at the agency will see this at some point, and maybe they'll call it up and yell at me or get upset or something, and I hope they do, because then we can have a conversation about it. And I would say, with all due respect to you guys, fix the website. Okay, let's look at the next slide. So this is what I just said. There's a bunch of places on the website that are not reflecting the actual language or intent of Section 504. I think there may, if I'm being fair to the agency, I think there may be places where they do. If I look for them, I could probably find some places where they do talk about accommodations and services. I guess what I would say to the agency is remove all the misleading stuff, because it affects parents when they get to the stage of trying to write a 504 plan.
Greg, I have a question about a 504 plan. When a student's on a 504, is there a requirement for a school to actually write a plan? Oftentimes we hear from families that the school will say, you know, your child's on a 504 plan, but they don't have a copy of what the specifics are. I know here we often say to families, it's best to have it in writing, but is there a requirement for them to have anything in writing from the school's perspective?
There's not a requirement in Section 504 for a written document, and that's very much unlike an IEP, right, where there are very detailed requirements about what belongs in the IEP, you know, the present levels of performance, the annual goals, the short-term objectives, the services being provided, all of those things. And that's a benefit of the IEP, because you get a lot more detailed and a lot more safeguards for an IEP, with all the descriptions of what the elements are. But just about everybody, I practice in Vermont and New Hampshire, and just about every school district has a writing of some kind. It might be a lot simpler and shorter than an IEP, but I mean, it doesn't make any sense to try to do it without a writing. And even though, sorry about that, even though it's not as detailed as an IEP, I would definitely advocate, as VFN does, I would advocate that we need to have a writing to get it clear so that the whole team is on the same page and we know what we're doing. Okay, let's look at the next slide. This is just about sometimes parents might go and provide something on their own. And I know there was a question put to VFN by someone who sent in a question before we started about whether they could get reimbursed by the school district for setting up tutoring services for a student on a 504 plan. So what this section says is, if the school district has made an appropriate education available and the parents go place a student in a private school, and I'm going to say, let's also say it may be it's tutoring. or a private school, then if the district has done a good job, then they're not required to pay for that. But then it says, about 2/3 of the way down, disagreements between a parent or a guardian and a recipient, meaning a school, regarding whether the recipient has made a free appropriate public education available or otherwise regarding the question of financial responsibility are subject to the due process procedures of 104.36. So conceivably, a parent could request funding for a private school or potentially tutorial services or another service if the parent could demonstrate that the school should have provided it and didn't. And that would be subject to the due process procedures, which in Vermont, you can request a due process hearing regarding any issue related to Section 504. And we'll get into that in a little more detail. Let's look at the next slide. This is just about not excluding any person with a disability from a public elementary or secondary education. We've kind of been over that. Let's do the next slide. This is in the educational setting. Part of this is, you might have heard about the least restrictive environment provision. This one says that we try to educate students with disabilities in the jurisdiction with persons who are not disabled as much as possible, to the maximum extent appropriate. But some students need to be placed outside of the environment that includes students who are not disabled. Some students have to be, in order to get their needs met, might be placed with other students who have disabilities or similar disabilities, and that's okay. It's not that every student must be in the regular education environment with non-disabled peers. It just means that you try to do that setting if you can. But if you need to do something else, then that's perfectly okay. All right, let's do the next slide. Section 504 also applies to non-academic setting. So things like extracurricular activities and recess and other services also have to be provided to students with disabilities. Next slide. This is about conducting an evaluation under Section 504. Schools have to conduct evaluations for any person who, because of a disability, needs special education or related services. And that is supposed to be done before the initial placement of the person. And also, this is unique to Section 504. The evaluation also has to be done before there's a significant change in placement later on. So if you have a student on a 504 plan and there's going to be some kind of a change, there might need to be an evaluation before that change happens.
Greg, can you talk about whether or not there's timelines with evaluations and whether or not a parent has a right to an independent evaluation on 504 as they do under IDEA? Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's another place where you don't have the same level of detail, you know, that you do in an IEP, and you don't have the same descriptions of timelines that you do under for an IEP. So if you're on an IEP, you've got some pretty specific timelines that might be laid out in the federal law, or they might be laid out in Vermont's special education regulations, you know, where Vermont has adopted the federal law into their own regulations. Every state has adopted their own set of regulations to basically implement the IDEA. There's a lot less under Section 504 about those timelines. And so, and a lot of the decisions and guidance kinds of things from the Office of Civil Rights, which is the main federal organization that enforces Section 504, you know, they talk about reasonable timelines for these things, and they use vague words like reasonable timelines. You know, they don't generally set up, this has to be done within 30 days or 60 days. And it's not really like that. As far as getting independent evaluations, parents are, it's different under Section 504 because under an IEP, if the school district does an evaluation and parents don't agree with it, then the parents can request an independent educational evaluation to be done at public expense, where the child would go to someone else, generally outside of the school district, and the school district would pay for that evaluation. We don't have that same setup under Section 504, but parents are allowed always to go get their own evaluations for their own child, and they're always allowed to bring that evaluation to the school district. And the school district has to consider that parent provided evaluation along with whatever other evaluation information is on the table, meaning, you know, school district evaluations or just parent input or teacher input or whatever it might be. So it definitely, parents can get it. It has to be considered. But they, as a general rule, probably wouldn't get funding to have it done. Some school districts will do that though, but it's just if it's a school district matter of choice. If they decide to provide funding for a Section 504 student, then okay, that would be good. They might do it, but there's not a general federal requirement to do it like there is under the IDEA.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, next slide. This is about evaluation and placement. We've kind of been over this. We can move on. This is an example of a place I'm going to skip over, but you'll have this information to go back to. 504. Okay, this is what Martha was just asking about. Evaluations obtained by parents. They can come from lots of different sources, doctor, hospital, therapist, and they are considered along with everything else. And when you go to get an evaluation, be sure to ask for specifics about the needs so that you can come to a 504 meeting and plug in what your child needs for services. You don't just want like a diagnosis. You also want, okay, then what are we going to do in the school setting to help the student? Okay, next slide. There are also procedural safeguards that school districts generally implement. If you comply with the IDEA, that's one way of doing it. A lot of school districts will have on their websites different 504 procedural safeguards, and you can check those out. Next slide. This is about non-academic services again, and we already looked at this. You can have that for reference. Next slide. It also applies to preschool and adult education, but it's not really the focus for today. Next slide. Private education is also sometimes provided. If someone providing private education is receiving federal dollars, then it would also apply in that setting. Next slide. Compensatory education is a topic that has come up with a fair number of parents, especially compensatory education is services required to make up for services that weren't provided. And that can generally happen in one of two ways. It could be services that were not provided because a school district just didn't or couldn't provide services. And then you might have to determine what makeup services are necessary to make up for that. And it might have happened because of COVID. Maybe and with respect to COVID, it's not a blame thing. You're not saying to the school district, hey, you did a bad job, or you intentionally hurt my child. It's more like COVID came and happened and it prevented my child from getting certain services. And so we need to make it right for my child. And so under Section 504, the Office for Civil Rights has reminded everyone that it's important to look at whether compensatory services are required to make up for things that services that were missed or instruction that was missed. And some factors to consider at the bottom of this slide, or the fourth bullet: frequency and duration of missed instruction and related services, the student's present levels of performance, previous rates of progress, and results of updated evaluations. So you look at those things to determine whether there's compensatory education required, and if so, what it is. Okay, next slide. Martha, how are we doing on time?
I think we're doing okay. I think we have maybe 10 more minutes.
Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit.
Okay.
This section here, I don't know how many people are familiar. I know a lot of people are, that in Vermont, we have adopted proficiency-based graduation requirements. So when we look at what's required for graduation, it's not just credits anymore. Credits is one element, but proficiency-based graduation requirements are all the things that we want a student to have before they go out into the world. And examples are literacy, global citizenship, health education, artistic expression, all of these things. And if you go online and you look at the Vermont Agency of Ed website, you can look at proficiency-based graduation requirements. And let's look at the next slide. And you can search Vermont Portrait of a Graduate. And if you look at that online, you'll see all the skills that we want a student to have. And again, it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It also includes the skills that are necessary to be a citizen of the world and to get employment and to function in the world after graduation. It's very broad. And when you go to write a 504 plan, you can address these things and say, you want these to be reflected in the 504 plan or in a personalized learning plan, a PLP, that could be tied to the 504 plan. But it's a good way to expand the conversation at a 504 meeting about the skills that we want the student to have and how do we get there. Let's look at the next slide. These are some examples of how detailed this can be, and in my mind, how useful they might be in a 504 setting. You can tell, like, students take ownership, act with focus and engagement, develop self-awareness, think independently, set goals, work with others. And the next slide, we got several slides here that talk about different aspects of this. Let's just buzz through these, like global citizenship. Here, understand and interpret and analyze what is heard, summarize important ideas. You get the idea. There are a lot of elements. Here's communication. Stick on this one for just a minute. Students communicate using oral, written, and nonverbal strategies, listen to understand another's perspective, understand about digital issues, voice their own opinions in a respectful manner. This is very broad. You get the idea. And I just like the idea of incorporating this in a 504 conversation. Critical thinking and problem solving is another one. And again, you can look at all this online in Portrait of a Graduate. And the agency has posted a lot of this on their website. School districts are allowed to develop their own criteria for their own kind of portrait of a graduate. So you check your own district's website and see what they've developed. Okay, next slide. There's a little bit in here about post-secondary education, and I just want everyone to be aware that Section 504 also does apply to colleges and other post-secondary kinds of services. It's not as broad as it is in elementary and secondary education. Colleges, for example, have to provide help to provide students with, well, we can look at the next slide. Well, there are requirements around not focusing on disabilities when it comes to admissions and recruitment, but essentially colleges are not required to alter the basic fundamental thing that they're doing. Like if there are requirements to achieve a certain degree, certain coursework, then the colleges are allowed to require those things to be done, but they can modify the way that they're done as long as it doesn't, you know, water down their program. And they can provide supports for students to help them to be successful in that program. It's not as broad as it is for lower education, but it is still a significant element. Next slide. That's another thing about the post-secondary treatment of students that you can have for your reference. Next slide. This is just an example of what I was saying. These academic adjustments, if you could back up one second to the academic adjustments. Yeah, thank you. You can make modifications to academic requirements to ensure that there's not the effect of discrimination. And in the following slide, you can alter elements related to course examinations and auxiliary aids that might include things like tape text, interpreters, or other methods of making materials available to students with hearing impairments or visual impairments, all those kinds of things. Next slide.
And we're at about 5 minutes, Greg.
5 minutes, okay. And housing in the post-secondary world is also an element. Next slide. Financial aid is also a consideration. A lot of these things, it's just good for you to know that you can go and look this up and read more about it if you have that issue yourself. Next slide. Same thing, non-academic services are also considered. Next slide. Also, there's a bullying and harassment element to Section 504, and you can, if we look at the next slide, the Agency of Education has a model bullying and harassment policy, which is related to Section 504, which is on the website, and school districts are required to adopt their own bullying and harassment policies. It's just, it's clear that bullying and harassment constitutes discrimination based on a disability, and that's how it's related to Section 504. Okay, next slide. School districts have to respond to this. You can read about that. It's not the primary focus for today, but just be aware of it. Next slide. The Office of Civil Rights will investigate issues of bullying and harassment. And then this slide, enforcing Section 504. As I said earlier, in Vermont, you can enforce Section 504 issues. A parent had asked prior to this session, what do you do if the school's not following the 504 plan? And you can either go to, you can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights in Boston, or you can go to mediation in Vermont, or you can file a due process request in Vermont. Vermont apparently does not allow administrative complaints for Section 504 cases. They refer those to the Office of Civil Rights, but you can do mediation or due process in Vermont, which is not the case. For example, there are some cases where you can't do that, but it's good to know that in Vermont, you can file due process or mediation or mediation. Okay, next slide. That's what we just went over. Do the next slide. This is from the Agency of Ed website that says students that are supported in the prior slide. Students that are supported by a 504 plan may file an administrative complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. So as opposed to the Agency of Education handling an administrative complaint. Okay, next slide. And then just, I think we're about out of time, but it's a good place to wrap up, which is, 504 is about services and providing appropriate services to meet the needs of students to the same extent as the needs of students without disabilities. And so that's probably one of the most important things to remember, that Section 504 is very broad. You can get a lot of services under 504. And also bear in mind that students presently covered by 504 may be eligible for IEPs as of next summer. Was there anything else that you would like to touch on, Martha?
Thank you, Greg. We probably have time for one or two questions. One question would be, oftentimes we hear from parents who have a child on an IEP, gee, my school said we're going to take your son off of an IEP and put him on a 504 before he graduates so that he's ready to go on to a post-secondary institution. And we've often said to families, that's really not necessary. Can you speak a little bit about that? And then we have one more question after that.
Okay, if a student has a disability and that student is on an IEP, then that student should remain on an IEP until that student is no longer eligible for an IEP. It doesn't have anything to do with the student going to college. I think some school districts, let's give school districts the benefit of the doubt and say that they're trying to be helpful. The best thing you could do in that situation would be keep the IEP in place, but make sure that the IEP defines specifically what the student needs, because that's what the college or post-secondary program is looking at the document for. They're not looking at it to see, is it an IEP or a 504 plan? They're looking at it for guidance about what they can do in the college setting to meet the needs of the student. And oftentimes an IEP might tell them things like, what about extended time for testing? Is that in the IEP or the 504 plan? What about, does the student need notes in advance from all the teachers? Is that in the plan? If so, the college is more likely to do those things. So whether it's a 504 or an IEP, I would say to the team, we don't need to change the document. We just need to focus on describing in the document what the student's going to need in the university setting.
Great. We also often tell families that the 504 plan, if they have one in high school, is not necessarily a given at the next institution. It's up to each institution to make their own 504 determination. And I think many times parents don't know that. They automatically think the 504 will follow them, and that's definitely not the case. So our last question, and thank you so much. You really addressed many of the questions that came in prior to our presentation. Let's see, we know from parents who will call our helpline that masking is a big concern, and it would be helpful if you could address masking in terms of a 504 accommodation. And that is our last question.
Okay. So a few days ago, I was doing some research because we were talking about this issue, and I looked at research nationwide on a search engine that we use for legal research. And there are a bunch of cases nationwide. And everybody knows that there's been a ton of litigation. A lot of parents fighting against masking, saying it's a violation of constitutional rights and don't make me wear a mask and all of that. And then a lot of parents fighting for masking, particularly parents who might have an immunocompromised child or a medically fragile child, wanting to force the district to do masking. Or some parents have filed federal cases wanting or objecting to an opt-out provision where parents could opt out of masking. And the parents are saying, no, if people opt out of the masking, then my medically fragile child is going to be exposed and put at risk. The decisions in all these cases have gone all over the place. Some courts have said, have upheld cases about, mask mandates are unconstitutional. Some parents who've come in and said under 504 and or other statutes, but I specifically searched 504, some of those parents did get orders that school district had to do universal masking in order to make a safe environment for a child. It was similar to banning peanuts for a student with a peanut allergy. But other parents were not successful. And the ones that I saw that were successful, they were just initially successful. Like they might have gotten a temporary injunction to require masking until the case could be fully decided. Almost all the cases, not all of them, but almost all the ones I saw were from 2021. So COVID hit in March of 20. By the time these things worked their way up to the federal court, which took some time, it was 2021, and they were making these decisions. There haven't been many of them lately, just a few, and I didn't see any from Vermont. Now, the Agency of Education is kind of taking the attitude of, hey, we're kind of getting done with masking. I think, it would be a more of an uphill climb right now for a parent to argue that universal masking should happen as a 504 element to protect an immunocompromised child, because the agency is moving away from it. Most school districts are moving away from it. People are just moving away from masking. And so the argument could technically be made. I think it's going to be harder now to be successful on that point, though. And some people have talked about, trying to do it, by agreement, like getting everybody to agree to mask. And I would start there. Okay. If I was trying to do it, I would start there, because I think forcing it legally is going to be harder, not impossible, but harder.
Okay. Greg, thank you so very much for participating in this really informational webinar. We really appreciate the time that you've spent putting this together and presenting to families. So thank you very much. And I'd like to tell our audience that we do have many more interesting workshops coming up, and you can find the details on our homepage of our website, vermontfamilynetwork.org, along with links to previously recorded ones. We have tons of information on our website, and getting connected connected with us is really easy. You can follow up on a Facebook or join us on a closed Facebook page if you're a parent. We have 2 closed Facebook groups. One's for parents of all children with disabilities and special needs, and one is for those with adult children. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter, our e-news, and check out our YouTube channel. We're here to help. And please contact us by phone or mail. And thanks again, everyone, for a great day. Greg, thanks again. Always such a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. I love working with you guys.
Thanks, Greg.
Bye.